Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today's going to be an unusual one because I usually do not cover DNFs, nor do I ever really find a book with as appropriate a name as this one. Tonight, I am going to be covering this book, The Unremembered. And this is the author's definitive edition. What that means is that when it was first published, it had a different length and there was a different amount of chapters, different amount of pages, and the definitive edition is kind of like a second it's like a do-over, a second chance at writing this book. The author is Peter Aurelian, and one of the things that pulled me to this book is this beautiful art. I try not to read any of I try not to read any of these books at the bookstore. I did all of that when I was a younger person, when I was a teenager at the Borders in town. It eventually became a Books a Million, but I don't like reading in the store anymore. I like a first impression and then taking it home after that first impression. I found this book, both the original version and the definitive edition, at Page One Books in Albuquerque, and I bought this for $11, the original price being $20.99. The cover art is by Kakai Kotaki. This was printed in the USA. This is a copyright 2015 book, first edition, April 2015. And earlier I mentioned that this book has an incredibly appropriate name, The Unremembered. And I think my issue with this book is that it doesn't really get to the point. I was halfway through the book and it just kept on bouncing between different characters, but it felt like it was doing that because it wanted to pad the length rather than get to the actual point. Now, the book is about a young man named Tan, Tahn, and he is a bit unusual because as an archer, he doesn't release an arrow until he prays to the gods, and if they will it, then he releases the arrow. But how he perceives that they will it is beyond the reader, at least through the portion of the book that I read. And I read it, I was really trying to read as far as I could. It was around, I think, chapter 50 that I just finally gave up because early on we see that several of the characters are very new to being adventurers or heroes or anything like that. One of them's just a farmer. One of them is the sister. The sister is the victim of a sexual assault who was impregnated by her assailant. And then one of these non-human, almost not, I don't want to say demonic, but these non-human antagonistic creatures took the baby shortly after it was born, and Tan, the main character, couldn't for some reason bring himself to shoot that creature. And so the cast involves this kind of sage-like character who uses a language of the gods to do fascinating things. There's this young woman who is a two-weapon fighting sword wielder. She fights with two swords. It is her whole culture to do so, but the culture is incredibly strange and I don't like it. And then there was Tan. There was this kid that they picked up for some reason along the way. There was this friend, a farmer, a friend of Ton. And so, like, the cast made no sense. And then at one point in time, the story branches out because they are in this misty area. And the sage, the swordswoman, and another character I hadn't previously mentioned are separated in one group, and then Ton and his friend are separated into another group, and then this kid and the sister of Ton end up being in a third group, and they're all trying to find their way back, not to each other, but to a meetup point that they believe everyone else is going to go to. That even if anyone is lost, they are going to get there. And there are certain aspects of the story that imply, like, the sister is very important to these non-human creatures, that the sorrow in her voice and her singing is really powerful. There's this implication that Ton is being constantly hounded and hunted by these creatures because he is important to them for whatever reason. Again, I got halfway through the book and it couldn't be bothered to tell you why. So it's giving you all this information about, oh, well, this person's important in maybe this way. This person's important in maybe that way. The third person might be important in another way, but we're not going to tell you why. That needs to be the climax or something. Halfway through the book and they can't be bothered to get to the goddamn point. It is terrible writing. It is god-awful writing. And I thought, I've discussed DNFs on this channel before. I thought that some of these were bad for reasons that could not be topped. And they're just bad for different, equally bad reasons. So, The Good Fairies of New York, I couldn't finish that because the two main characters, effectively, were just such awful human beings that there was no reason I could find to actually continue reading their story. It's not that the characters are uninteresting, it's that the winding path this author is going down makes no sense whatsoever. And in the past, I think I discussed this with The Wizard Knight, I think is the one it was called. That one I had a hard time finishing because it was too non-linear in its narration. There was too much jumping back and forth between 15 years ago, 7 years from the future, 12 years from that one, 25 years ago, back to before he was ever isekai'd, back to 100 years and as he's dying. It's jumping around. That one jumped around too much, but internally, the story in each chapter made sense, and it made sense to me what was going to happen within those chapters. It was just too hard to become invested because of how non-linear that story was. And the Unremembered is a lot like that, where it is bouncing around too much, but it doesn't give you a good enough reason for that bouncing around. And so instead we get this character that is like born into a family of scribes or something like that. And instead we get the sage. It turns out the sages generally have wives, but recently these antagonistic non-human creatures have found a way to sever the bond between this sacred bond between the sages and their wives. And so the widows have their own community, and this scribe's son is seducing or sleeping with one of these widows and treating her like she isn't a scarred woman, and the scar has affected how she perceives herself, and that this scribe's son is willing to give her the time of day and appreciation and respect despite that. But it's like, why do I care about this sub-story at all? It doesn't add to the overarching plot. And if it does, it sure as hell doesn't tell me in what way it does by the halfway point of the book. And there's another one where, like, all of the female characters, it seems that they are treated as if their ultimate goal in life should be having kids. And that the swordswoman is unusual because she wants to have kids, but she doesn't want to follow her culture's rigid path of they die shortly after adulthood, and so no one ever really fathers or mothers their kid, and that older members of the culture will take care of the kids. It's like that her greatest desire is to not die shortly after adulthood like everyone else before her, that she wants to be a mother to her kid. And in that kind of culture, I can understand it. In a vacuum, it's a stupid friggin' culture to write into this. But in that setting, I can understand maybe not wanting to die shortly after adulthood and actually getting time to spend with your kid. That kind of makes sense. But this paired with the way Tan's sister seems to, like, want, she doesn't want to, Tan's sister doesn't want the predator that preyed upon her, that assaulted her, to get in any trouble. She is very fond of this kid, and it's a very evangelical Christian look at how victims of sexual assault should act in regards to their ill-conceived child, that their child was conceived through a crime, through assault, but that they will still love that kid regardless, and that her goal is to be that mother. The female characters seem to have this attitude that their greatest goal in life should be to be a mother. And so you've got that going on. You've got this weird side story about a character seducing a widow who has terrible burn scars. What's the relevance to the plot there? They don't tell you, but there's also this story of Tan's sister. When she's separated, she tries to find the kid because she has injured legs and she can't actually move around. She's got an infection she's trying to fight off. And then when she does leave this cave that she's hiding in, she does eventually find people, but it's this group of bandits that are going to assault her unless the captain takes action, and he does. And what does he do? He brings her as his captured slave to go to another place where he's going to gamble away what money he does have, and when going all in, gambles her just to get the information he needs. And it's like all of this doesn't make sense except to pad the story. There's one encounter that might be consequential to the plot where they meet some traveling performers, and the traveling performers appreciate the sorrow and originality in her voice, that there's something powerful in the way she sings. And, like, yeah, she's been traumatized like 20 different times. She's got a lot of trauma and sorrow in her singing voice. Like, get to the point. Why is that important to the plot? And again, I got 50 chapters deep. There was no reason to go 50 chapters into the story and not know a single thing about what the plot of the story is. And there are 71 chapters. I read about 300 pages and I still could not see where the plot was going. This is just an awful book. And to be brutally honest, I can say I roughly understand why this book is named The Unremembered, because that is one of the few, very few, exceptionally few things this book actually explains. And it doesn't even explain it, it just indicates that Tan has these memories that he, from before a certain age, he does not have anymore, that is partly why he is important to this saving the world plot. And if he could only unlock those, then he might be able to save the world. it implies that. I don't even know if that's how it resolves, because again, chapter 50 out of 71, it still hasn't explained why is his inability to remember before a certain age actually relevant to the plot. So when I said at the start that this is an incredibly relevant title for a book, I am going to actively try to not remember this. I'm not going to forget this book. I am going to actively try to not remember. It will be unremembered to me. That is why it's relevant, because this is one of the worst books I have ever read. I could not tell what the point of it ever was, and I genuinely wish I had not wasted $11 on this book. And I mean it. I wasted $11 on this book. And I really hope if you see this, the definitive edition or the original version, whatever that was, do not pick it up. Leave it on the shelves and walk away. This book should not be at all a thing you read. If a book, the first book you read is an introduction to an author, then this is the worst introduction I have ever seen. And it is going back into the used book system, and I honestly want to tell them, please don't even give me credit for this one, because you're not going to get your money's worth back. Like, I don't even want credit for returning this book. That's how awful it is. So, yeah. On that note, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.